Hello everyone, my name is Rachel Fletcher and I'm a business advisor with Business Sheffield. And I'm here today to tell you about how you can get involved in procurement opportunities across the city. We had an event back in September 2024 and we realised that businesses were struggling to find out about tender opportunities and understand the tender process. And so I've put together 3 workshops today, which I'm going to explain a little bit more about how to get involved in tendering. The first one is about becoming tender ready. The second one is about managing the tender process. And the third one is about hints and tips. I hope you find it useful. Thank you very much. So thinking about bidding for public sector tendering, what are the differences between public and private sector tendering? And this is a really common misunderstanding. And so what I've done here is create a table listing how things operate from the public sector perspective and also how things then operate in the private sector. So firstly, on the public sector, we've got things such as national procurement laws, we've got the value for money, so the most economically advantageous tender. We've got CSR, corporate social responsibility, has been a really key priority and driver. Advertising is highly regulated, so all tenders will be advertised through a range of procurement portals which are totally transparent and easily accessible and free to access. There's usually a very specific tender format that you have to adhere to. The winner following a transparent evaluation process, and so you can get scores and feedback. And I would say most importantly, there is no waiting. So just because you know an organisation, and even if you worked for them before, that can't be taken into consideration in this current opportunity. Now this compares quite starkly to the private sector, and this is sort of typical, but they have a legal duty to shareholders, so it's much more about the wider business than any particular law that has to be adhered to. Cost is typically the driver rather than anything else. It's what's the best price. There's corporate social responsibility is important, but it perhaps isn't the most important thing in a tender response. Advertising is unregulated, so you may get emails or just somebody asking you to respond. The tender format is once again unregulated, so this will be something that you can devise yourself. Subjective and objective criteria is used when coming to judging who is going to be selected. And finally, the relationship may enhance your opportunity or your chance of winning that piece of work. So there's quite a difference between public and private sector tendering. And I think it's really important when an organisation is deciding to bid for public sector tendering that they really understand the landscape that they're operating within and the issues that may impact them. So then if we go on to time management, another key tip, because tendering always does take a lot longer than people first anticipate. So the first thing to think about is not to underestimate the amount of time you'll need to prepare and submit a tender. It's then also to think about considering the timetable. When are the deadlines? When are the clarifications responses got to be in? Is there a site visit at a particular time? How can you organise that? You'll then also need to schedule the amount of time that you need to be able to respond to a particular question. And I would always recommend that you plan out each stage in terms of how long something's going to take you to respond and compile an answer, and giving yourself a bit of contingency so you've got a bit of extra time if more time is required, if the response is perhaps a bit more complex than first appears. I would also suggest that you identify a bid team rather than it just being one individual in an organisation, and try and split that bid writing across the organisation, allocating it to individuals with particular areas of expertise. And then finally, be prepared to submit before the deadline, because so many people will just be submitting on the deadline or very close to the deadline that sometimes there can be problems with portals and overload. And I've even known where portals close down early because there's been too many submissions or things are taking too long to upload. Or if it's a very big tender response, if something is taking a long time to upload, then actually the deadline can pass during that upload process. And then unfortunately your tender wouldn't then be classed as submitted. So time management is an absolute key aspect to submitting a successful tender. It's also, I would say, understanding the standard questionnaire. What are the key things that you need to think about here? And what does it actually encompass? Well, you've got your basic information. So it's all about your organisation, contact details, memberships, any parent companies or group companies that you're part of. And then the second element is all around, and third, to be honest, is all around declarations. And this is the bit that often puts people off, because they'll see a standard questionnaire, which typically is around 13 pages in length. And they'll think, goodness me, that's an awful lot of information I've got to complete. But in reality, it's much more about these self-declaration questions around things such as money laundering or modern slavery. And the vast majority of businesses will be answering no to all those responses, that their business hasn't been impacted by that. And so actually, even though it looks like 13 pages, probably 11 of those pages will be just tick box questions that you can work through quite quickly. There'll then be in part 5 here confirmation of your organisation's economic and financial standing. So that's often accounts if you've got them, but if not, it could be, for example, if you're a startup business, it might be some cash flow and profit forecasts. It might be a letter from your bank. So it can be a whole host of different things to just show that you as an organisation have a good financial standing. And then finally, you've got part 6, which is the technical and professional ability. And these are typically case studies of projects that you've done previously that are most relevant to this particular opportunity. And so you can compile that information beforehand, so that when it comes to compiling this or completing the standard questionnaire, you've got a lot of this information already available. In terms of responding to the tender opportunity, in terms of another tip, I would always say use the specification to help shape your response. And I've listed here, I think there's about 7 different points that I would always recommend that you cover and think about. So the first thing to understand is, what's the background to this opportunity? Why is the public sector looking to buy this particular service or this particular piece of equipment? So is it a strategy that they're aiming to deliver, or is it a need that they've got? So if you can understand that particular context, then I think that helps you write a better response. You then start to think about what are the priorities, and this is the priorities of the buyer. What are they looking to achieve, and how can you help them achieve those particular priorities? Then also start to think about the scope of service, so thinking through what's the total scope of what the buyer's looking to do. Is it over so many years? Is it a relatively quick piece of work that needs undertaking, so that you fully understand the opportunity? And then start to look at the opportunity and whether it's divided into lots. And what I mean by lots is where the buyer will split that opportunity into a number of distinct things that you can bid for. So sometimes you might bid for all the lots in a particular tender, or alternatively, you might just bid for a specific element that you're most expert in. And so it's important when you look at a tender opportunity to ensure that the specific tender is divided into lots, and that you can respond to them individually, or if that's not the case, if you have to respond to all lots, that you do have the expertise and experience to be able to do that. I would then look at management information, and so this is started to think about, if you are successful, what management information will they require you to deliver throughout the contract period, and do you have the systems or the processes in place to collect that data? And then finally, this comes back to funding and cash. Their payment terms. How long is it until you get that first payment? Is there any sort of upfront payment that's a possibility? And if not, can you cash flow it if you have quite considerable startup costs? And so these are all key things that you can think about and explore when you're pulling a tender together. So things to consider before you even put pen to paper. So I would always say things to think about before you start. Don't assume that the reader knows anything about you. You may have, or your organisation may have delivered this contract before, but the tender may be being read by someone who has no knowledge of your organisation. So I would absolutely recommend you start from the basics and explain who you are, what you do, and your track record as a particular organisation. I would then also think about the wider assets of the organisation. So this might be physical assets such as locations or premises, but it also could be relationship assets such as networks that you're part of, or previous activity that you've delivered. And because all these things can be really helpful in the future if you're delivering a particular contract. I would also compile some really good strong case studies, because this gives really good evidence and examples to provide assurance to the buyer that you really do understand and can deliver what they're looking for you to deliver. I would absolutely be aware of what you write in the tender response, because the last thing you want to do is to write a response that sounds really great but in reality is undeliverable. And so if they're asking for a service to be delivered or something to be delivered in 12 months, then you want to make sure that you can deliver that over 12 months and you're not taking on something that for you as an organisation would actually be undeliverable. I would include details of how you're going to do something as well as what you're going to do. And having good formatting, it sounds once again quite basic, but it's amazing how many tenders are very poorly written, poor formatting, and makes it really difficult to understand a buyer's response. And so make sure that you do set out your response really clearly. And then don't just use ChatGPT or any other AI mechanism to generate your response, because although when you read it, it looks fantastic because it's auto-generated, what you've got to remember is that other organisations may also be using this software. And so if you get 6 or 7 responses that all look the same, then it really reduces your credibility as a supplier, when you're submitting responses to particular questions. So I would say use AI carefully rather than as a key element to your response. So write your response in your own words, absolutely. And then just finally, tips to consider when bid writing. Answer the question that's being asked. I would say this is the most common reason why people get this wrong, is that they read a question and then they misinterpret what is actually being asked. And so I would read a question, read it again, and then start to think very clearly about what is being asked and how you can respond to the specific points. Highlight key sentences, so use italics and bold where possible, because it's just easier to, as a reader, when you're looking at something, to pick things out, pick the key points out. Use the question to structure your response. What I mean by this is if there are 3 or 4 parts to a question, I would answer them in that order and in that format, so that when the evaluator is looking at your response, they can quickly tick off that you've answered each point in turn. Be succinct. Always note the word count. It's very important that if a question asks for a maximum of 200 words, that you don't go over that, because particularly if it's an electronic submission, then your answer potentially could just be cut off. And also think about not answering too briefly either. If it says 200 words, then don't put 5. It's really important to give sufficient detail. If they've asked for 200 words in a response, they're looking for that level of detail. Use the client's language. So really important that you don't use jargon and colloquialisms. Use diagrams where possible. It's not always possible because obviously tender formats are regulated, so you may not be able to do that. But I really do think where possible, diagrams can be so helpful to explain quite complex concepts. Double check your finance tables. It's surprising how often people miscalculate things and either go in too low or too high. Use internal expertise to answer specific questions. I think I talked about this earlier, but it's important that if you've got a quality expert in your organisation, I would involve them in answering the quality question, because the more expertise you've got, the better response you'll be able to create. But always proofread and certainly ensure that there's a unified voice. I think this becomes a challenge when a number of individuals are drafting a response, because we all have our own style of writing, and it can be quite off-putting to an evaluator if all questions are answered in a slightly different way. So I would always ask someone in the organisation to read the whole thing before it's submitted and create this unified voice, which is much more helpful. Editing, absolutely ask a critical friend to read it and sense check it, because usually if you've written something and you've tried your best in doing that, it's very difficult to stand back and be able to see whether it's answering all the points raised. So think that through carefully. Cross-reference any additional documents, so it's really clearly explain where those documents are. Check references. Make sure that if you're giving an organisation as a reference, they'll give a positive reference about you. because I've experienced it a number of times where I've been involved as an evaluator reviewing bids, and the references have not been as positive as the applicant would have hoped. And then finally, check the submission process. The last thing you want to do is to spend a long time pulling together a really excellent tender response to actually miss the deadline. So there's some tips there for bid writing.
I hope you enjoyed the sessions. Please do look at the other workshops in the series. Thank you.